Welcome back, everyone, to the channel Confessions of the Elderly. On the 29th of Tet, I had a high fever of 41 degrees. My mother-in-law cursed, "Get out and go back to your parents, don't stay here and jinx the whole new year." My husband immediately packed our things and we left together. On the second day of Tet, my mother-in-law frantically called me 50 times. On the 29th of Tet that year, while the house was busy cleaning, shopping, and preparing the year-end feast, I was sitting slumped on the kitchen floor at my in-laws. My body was burning hot, my lips were purple, and my hands were shaking so much I couldn't even hold a knife to slice ginger. I had a 41-degree fever, yet what I remember most isn't the fever itself, but my mother-in-law's knife-cold words. New Year's Eve is almost here. Why get sick now of all times? You just had to choose the 29th of Tet to lie there like that. My name is Javi. I was 36 years old that year, working as an administrative accountant for a home appliance distribution company. I had been married to my husband, Min Kwan, for 8 years. He is a refrigeration engineer, gentle and quiet. He's not heartless, but has one huge weakness. He is too submissive to his mother. After marriage, we lived with my mother-in-law, Mrs. Lazan, and my brother-in-law, Pham Thuan, in a 3-story house in an old residential area. The family wasn't poor, nor were we struggling enough to have to pinch pennies for every meal. But I don't know why, every Tet, I always felt that I was no longer a daughter-in-law but an unpaid worker in that very household. From the 25th of Tet, I almost never had a moment to sit still. Work in the morning, rush home to clean in the afternoon, wiping the altar, polishing the bronze incense burners, washing curtains, cleaning every glass pane, changing bedsheets, washing piles of old dishes for the holidays, and at night, sitting down to list items to buy, ordering chickens and gift baskets, buying incense and flowers, picking out sweets, and preparing both the year-end offerings and food to serve guests during the first days of the year. My mother-in-law would just walk in and out, holding a rag, but in reality, she was only there to give orders. She always said that during Tet, the house must be sparkling clean, so that outsiders looking in would know the family is blessed. It sounds like it's for the sake of family discipline, but the only one making that blessed house sparkle was me alone. Mrs. Lazan is very image-conscious. When guests visit, she loves to brag about her capable daughter-in-law, a tidy kitchen, and a full table. But behind those boasts are nights I spend hunched over in the kitchen, my hands cracked from dish soap, my shoulders aching from carrying crate after crate. My brother-in-law Thuan is over 30 and still has no steady job. He spends all day lounging on the sofa, scrolling on his phone, playing games, and occasionally looking up to complain, "Why does it take you so long? Even just a few snacks take you all day." Once, Min Kwan saw me carrying a heavy basin of laundry in from the backyard. He rushed over to help, but my mother-in-law immediately frowned. Men shouldn't get involved in women's work. Let his wife do it. What did we marry her for? She said that so casually, as if it were a matter of fact. I felt a lump in my throat, but I stayed silent. I told myself that everyone is stressed near Tet. I'll just endure it for a few days for the sake of peace at home. The hardest part for a married woman is often not the workload, but knowing she is being looked down upon yet having to smile through it to avoid being called disrespectful. On the morning of the 29th of Tet, I woke up before 5 a.m. It was still pitch black when I went to the kitchen to wash the chicken, soak the noodles, slice the bamboo shoots, and prepare the broth for the afternoon's offerings. I had only slept for 3 hours the night before because I was up wrapping gifts for my husband's relatives. While preparing the offering chicken, my vision suddenly blurred, my throat felt parched, my ears rang, and my hand holding the knife trembled. I had to brace one hand against the counter to keep from falling. I took the thermometer out of the cabinet to check. The number that appeared startled me. 40.5 degrees. My body was burning up, but my spine felt freezing cold. I knew I wasn't okay, but looking at the mountain of work left and hearing my mother-in-law calling out from the living room, "Wipe the altar again. It still doesn't look clean." I only dared to quickly take 2 fever reducers and kept working. All I could think of in my head was to push through a little longer. I could rest once the offering was done. But the human body is not a machine. By late morning, I could no longer stand on my own. My chest felt heavy, breathing was as difficult as if someone had placed a stone on it, my lips were cracked, my head pounded, and my legs felt like jelly. I tried to reach for a bowl of water but ended up dropping it onto the floor. The sound of shattering echoed through the kitchen. I slumped down, back against the cabinet, cold sweat soaking through my clothes. Just then, Min Kwan returned from grocery shopping, walked into the kitchen, and saw me sitting on the floor, deathly pale. He panicked, threw the bags down, and rushed to hold me. "What happened to you? Your body is burning up. He pressed his hand to my forehead, his expression changing instantly. I moved my lips, unable to speak, and pointed to the thermometer on the table. He picked it up, his voice cracking. 41 degrees, we need to go to the hospital right now. Just as Min Kwan was about to pick me up, my mother-in-law walked in from the living room. She looked at the broken shards on the floor, the bags he had carelessly tossed aside, and then at me with a look of annoyance rather than concern. She frowned, her voice icy. New Year's Eve is almost here. Of all times to get sick, you chose the 29th of Tet to just collapse like that. There's so much work left to do in the house, and now you're adding this hospital trip to the mix. I looked up at her, my throat tight. The fever blurred my vision, but every word she said was crystal clear. At that moment, I didn't know that just a few minutes later, that very cruel remark would make Min Kwan do something he hadn't dared to do in his 8 years as a husband in front of his mother. Min Kwan didn't answer his mother immediately. He just leaned down, one arm over my shoulder, the other behind my back, trying to lift me up. My body was limp. As soon as I left the kitchen floor, I felt so dizzy I had to cling tightly to his shirt. I heard my mother-in-law tutting behind us. Who are you putting on this show for? If you have a fever, take some medicine and lie down. Everyone is tired during Tet. Min Kwan whipped around, his voice low but heavy. Mother, look at Vis's face. She's burning like fire. Her lips are turning blue, and you still say she's overreacting? Mrs. Lazan paused for a beat, perhaps because for many years, he had never spoken to her in that tone. But then she immediately frowned and pulled her silk scarf tighter around her neck. Her voice sharpened. Did I say something wrong? The whole family is preparing for Tet. Guests will be here any minute. If she just lies there, who will take care of everything? Are you really going to drop all the housework just to take her to the hospital? I wanted to tell him to stop arguing, that just taking me to my room to lie down for a while would be enough. But my throat was parched, and the sounds I made were just broken breaths. Min Kwan didn't hesitate any longer. He grabbed a coat to cover me, turned to his mother, and said, housework can wait. My wife has a 105-degree fever. I'm taking her to the doctor. Quote, after saying that, he helped me toward the door. The neighborhood clinic was packed that day. Everyone is in such a rush during the final days of the year. People coughing, others feverish, children crying, adults sighing. I leaned on Min Kwan's shoulder, eyes squeezed shut, drifting in and out of consciousness. When the nurse checked my temperature, she looked at the reading and hurriedly called for the doctor. The doctor listened to my lungs, checked my throat, and asked how long I'd had a fever. Had I been overworking? Min Kwan stood nearby, his face turning pale when he heard me say I'd been feverish since morning but still tried to cook until noon. The doctor spoke sternly. A fever this high cannot be taken lightly. There are signs of pneumonia and total exhaustion. I must be monitored closely at home, take medicine on time, and get absolute rest. If the fever persists, or if I have trouble breathing or become delirious, I must be hospitalized immediately. He turned to look at Min Kwan and added, waiting until a patient reaches 105 degrees is very dangerous. A little longer and she could have had seizures. These complications are not a joke. Quote, Min Kwan bowed his head, his hand gripping mine tightly. I could clearly feel his palms were slick with sweat. On the way back, he didn't say much, just occasionally turned to ask, are you still having trouble breathing? Are you cold? Hold on just a little longer, we'll get home, I'll give you your medicine, and you can rest. Quote, his voice sounded both full of love and deep regret. Hearing it made my nose sting with tears. I didn't know if it was the fever or because it had been years since I had felt my husband's concern so clearly. But that warmth was met with a cold splash of water the moment we arrived home. Mrs. Lazan stood in the middle of the living room with her arms crossed, looking stern, with several unfinished dishes still left on the table. Beside her, Thuan sat with his legs crossed, looking at his phone and cracking melon seeds. Seeing us walk in, he just glanced over and remarked, you're back? I thought my sister-in-law was going to be hospitalized so she wouldn't have to cook for the feast. I stopped in my tracks, my whole body trembling. Min Kwan immediately glared at his younger brother. Thuan fell silent. Thuan shrugged and smirked. I'm just being honest. There's so much to do, Mom has a backache, and I don't know how to cook. She got sick at such a convenient time, didn't she? My mother-in-law didn't scold Thuan. Instead, she went along with him. What's wrong with what he said? If a woman in this house gets sick at the slightest thing, what can we even expect from her? Min Kwan helped me toward our room, but Mrs. Lazan blocked us right at the door. She looked me up and down with a cold gaze, as if staring at a broken object. Let me tell you, this family doesn't need a weak daughter-in-law who causes a mess at the slightest provocation. During Tet, people avoid illness and bad luck. If you have such a high fever, go back to your parents' house to lie down. Don't stay here and jinx our entire new year." Those words felt like a stab to my chest. I had been preparing for Tet for this family for several days straight. I had endured the sarcasm, the laziness of my brother-in-law, and the unreasonableness of my mother-in-law, all for the sake of a peaceful Tet. Yet, when I was sick to the point of collapse, in her eyes, I wasn't a person in need of care, but a piece of bad luck that needed to be cast out. I forced myself to say, "Mom, I am not faking my illness. The doctor said I need rest," but she immediately cut me off. "Every doctor says that. Don't use that as an excuse to be lazy. If you want to lie down, go to your mother's house to do it. My house will not accommodate someone who brings bad luck during Tet." The air in the living room grew thick and heavy. I thought Min Kwan would remain silent like he had so many times before, that he would help me to the room and tell me to endure his mother for a little while to let it pass. But this time, he gently let go of my hand, helped me sit on a chair, and then stood tall, facing his mother directly. He said each word clearly. "Fine, if you've told V to go back to her parents, then I'm going with her." Mrs. Lazan glared. "What did you say?" Min Kwan looked at his mother, his voice quiet but icy cold. "If this house considers my wife a bad omen, then I have no reason to stay here for Tet." I looked up at him, my heart trembling even through the fever, while Mrs. Lazan stood frozen in the living room. It was as if she had never imagined her always patient son would dare to stand up for his wife in front of her like that. As soon as Min Kwan finished, the entire living room went deathly silent. The TV in the living room was still playing a spring music program. The host's laughter and chatter rang out vividly. Yet inside that house, the air felt as cold as if a toxic wind had just blown through. I sat leaning against the chair, my body still shivering, staring at my husband, unable to believe this was the same Min Kwan. The man who for 8 years had always chosen silence whenever his mother raised her voice, today stood tall before her, declaring he would leave with me. Mrs. Lazan stunned for a few seconds, then erupted as if someone had set her on fire. She lunged forward and pointed a finger at her son's face. "Have you lost your mind, Kwan? For a woman, you dare to abandon your mother on the 29th of Tet? I raised you to be a grown man, and now you put your wife on a pedestal so she can turn you against your own mother?" Her voice was shrill, filled with both anger and disbelief. The way she called me a woman made my heart ache. But I was too tired to even react. Min Kwan didn't argue back. He just stared at his mother for a long time, his gaze both pained and cold. Then he turned to me and leaned down to help me stand. "Go lie down in the room for a moment. I'll pack our things, and then we'll leave." I weakly clung to his arm. My voice was hoarse. "Don't make a scene during Tet because of me. I can lie down for a bit, and we can figure it out tomorrow." I said that not because I wasn't hurt, but because years of being a daughter-in-law had made me accustomed to fear. Afraid of my in-laws saying I was driving a wedge between mother and son, afraid of the neighbors gossiping, afraid of causing a family disturbance before the first day of Tet had even arrived. Min Kwan looked at me, his eyes turning red. He reached out to brush the sweat-dampened hair from my forehead, his voice dropping low. "I've been silent for too long. If I let you lie there and endure this humiliation today, I am not fit to be your husband." That sentence was like a stone thrown straight into the frozen lake in my heart. I couldn't cry because I was too exhausted, but my eyes stung. It turns out he wasn't unaware. It turns out he saw all the grievances I'd swallowed for years. He just took too long to finally stand up for me. He helped me into the room, sat me against the headboard, and began opening the wardrobe. The sound of the door opening, hangers clattering, and drawers sliding rang out clearly amidst the shouting outside. Min Kwan grabbed some of my clothes, a thick coat, a wool scarf, my newly prescribed medicine, my medical records, and my ID. He even packed my phone charger, the spare fever medication, and the bottle of medicated oil I kept in the drawer. His movements were fast but not at all frantic. The more I watched, the more I realized he wasn't acting out of a moment of anger. He had truly made up his mind. Outside in the living room, Mrs. Lazan was still screaming, "If you step out of this house, don't blame me for disowning you. Leaving home during Tet just to follow your wife. People will laugh in my face." Thuan chimed in as well. His voice was lazy but full of provocation. "Think carefully, Brother Kwan. Once you leave, don't expect to come back begging for food. This house is not short of people." Min Kwan heard them but didn't answer right away. He zipped up the suitcase, helped me stand, and only then stepped outside. Mrs. Lazan blocked the main door. She spread her arms as if to seal off the path, her face flushed with anger. "This house is not a marketplace where you can come and go as you please. Where are the vehicle papers? Where are the keys? What are you taking from this house?" Min Kwan put the suitcase down, took the house keys, and placed them on the table. The sound of metal hitting glass was dry and sharp. He said, "I am only taking my personal belongings to take my wife to the doctor. I am leaving the house keys here." Mrs. Lazan gritted her teeth. "I don't believe you haven't been bewitched by her. A mother says a few words and she acts as if she's so wrong." At that moment, Min Kwan looked at his mother, his voice low but every word crystal clear. "Mother, please don't call cruelty a family tradition. She has a fever of 106 degrees. The doctor said it's dangerous, yet all you care about is the feast and what people will say. I don't mind leaving empty-handed, but I cannot let my wife be treated like a jinx in this very house." Thuan let out a cold laugh and flicked a melon seed shell into the ashtray. "You speak so well. Your wife is precious as gold, while Mom and I are nothing to you. When you run out of money and a place to stay, don't come back here whining." Min Kwan turned to look at his younger brother. His gaze made Thuan freeze in place. He spoke slowly, "I'm not begging anyone for food. I'm just afraid you'll be the one begging for debt forgiveness someday." The moment those words dropped, Thuan's face shifted. Very quickly. He bent down to pick up his phone, pretending he hadn't heard. But I could clearly see his hand trembling slightly. As Min Kwan helped me to the car, the late-year afternoon wind bit into my face. In the small alley, a few houses had already hung red and yellow fairy lights. The scent of boiled banh chung lingered in the air. People were preparing for Tet, while my husband and I left his home with a single suitcase, my body burning with a fever. Mrs. Lazan still stood at the gate, cursing after us, "Get out of my sight, and don't come crawling back on the first or second day of Tet to apologize." I leaned against the passenger seat, my head spinning, my eyes fluttering open and shut. Min Kwan fastened my seatbelt, pulled my coat up to my neck, and started the engine. As the car rolled away, he immediately called my mother. His voice was hoarse. "Mom, I'm bringing V home. V has a very high fever. The doctor said she needs close monitoring. Could you please prepare some things for us? If her fever doesn't break, I'm taking her straight to the hospital." On the other end of the line, I heard my mother's frantic, rapid questions, but I no longer had the strength to hear clearly. Through the rearview mirror, I saw Mrs. Lazan's silhouette still standing at the gate, her figure shrinking behind the evening mist. At that moment, perhaps both she and Thuan thought we were just throwing a tantrum and would return in a few days. No one knew that on that very afternoon of the 29th of Tet, when she chased me out of the house with the cruelest words, she had also pushed Min Kwan out of her control forever. And no one expected that, just a few days later, the house she tried to protect with her pride would explode from a long-rotting secret. As the car stopped in front of my mother's house, I could no longer tell the difference between the engine sound and my own heartbeat. My eyes were heavy, my throat felt like it was on fire, and every breath caused a sharp pain in my chest. As Min Kwan walked over to open the door, I collapsed completely toward him. He called out in a panic, "V, stay with me, we're at your mom's house." But his voice sounded distant, as if echoing from deep underwater. My mother, Kim Hwa, ran out of the house when she heard the car. She was still wearing her old apron, her hands covered in rice flour from making year-end cakes. Seeing me being carried out by Min Kwan, her face turned deathly pale. "Oh my God, what happened to my child?" She rushed over to touch my forehead, then flinched as if she had just touched a burning coal. My body was scorching, but my hands and feet were freezing cold, my lips cracked and purple. Min Kwan didn't hide anything. As he helped me inside, he said quickly with a hoarse voice, "Mom, V has a 106-degree fever. I already took her to the doctor. The doctor said there are signs of pneumonia and she needs to be monitored closely at home." My mother-in-law kicked V out, saying she was bad luck for the Lunar New Year. By the last sentence, his voice choked up. My mother stood frozen, her eyes turning red instantly. I know my mother's temperament. She is usually gentle and rarely raises her voice, but when it comes to her children, she doesn't take things lightly. She asked with a trembling voice, "She's this sick, and they still have the heart to say that?" Min Kwan hung his head, not daring to look her in the eye. "It's my fault, Mom. I let this go on for far too long." My mother gripped her towel tightly, looking at him with a mix of anger and pain. But she didn't blame him further. She just turned and went into the house to grab my coat, wallet, and documents, saying curtly that the rights and wrongs could wait. "Get her to the hospital first. If we can't save her life, what's the point of arguing?" That sentence made my nose sting, even in my delirious state. Spent the whole afternoon at my husband's house. I was treated like a jinx that needed to be dumped. Yet back at my mother's, the first thing she thought of wasn't honor, nor who was right or wrong, but her daughter's life. Perhaps in this world, wherever mom is, that is where home truly is. Upon reaching the hospital, I was taken in for a re-examination. The white ceiling lights glided by, and the smell of antiseptic stung my nose. The clattering wheels of the gurney echoed with a cold, rhythmic sound. The doctor checked my temperature, listened to my lungs, reviewed my vitals, and ordered me to be hospitalized for observation. He told Min Kwan and my mother, a high fever of 105 degrees cannot be taken lightly. The patient shows signs of a respiratory infection and is also severely exhausted. If she continues to work or just stays home, the risk of seizures and respiratory failure is very dangerous. Quote, Min Kwan stood silently by the hospital bed, his shoulders slumped. When the nurse finished the IV and my mother went out to buy some congee, he finally sat down beside me. His hand held mine very gently, as if afraid that any extra pressure would cause me pain. He looked at the needle in the back of my hand, his eyes red. I'm sorry. I kept thinking that if I just endured my mother a little, our home would be peaceful. I thought as long as I didn't argue, everything would pass, but it turns out you were the one suffering the most. Quote, I was too exhausted to speak, just looking at him. Min Kwan kept his head down for a long time before continuing, his voice lower. There are many things I hid from you, not because I wanted to lie to you, but because I was a coward. I was afraid that if you knew, you'd be disappointed, and afraid our family would become more chaotic. Quote, hearing that, my heart suddenly sank. I had a gut feeling that what he was about to say wasn't just about a difficult mother-in-law or a lazy sister-in-law. He shared that for the past few years, Mrs. Lazan had been frequently asking him for money. At first, she said it was to fix the roof, handle family offerings, give to relatives, and pay for village dues and medication. Min Kwan loved his mother, so he gave it to her. Some months he gave a few million, some months as much as 10 million. But later he discovered that most of that money wasn't used for the house at all, but went into her gambling hands. My brother-in-law, who I thought was just lazy and playful, had actually been in debt for a long time. I forced myself to ask, my voice hoarse, how much is the debt? Min Kwan closed his eyes when he found out it was over 100 million. Mom made him keep quiet, saying not to shame the family before Tet, and let her teach him herself. But months later, the amount grew, and once, strangers even came to the house looking for Thuan. They stood at the gate and said some very unpleasant things. Mom was afraid the neighbors would find out, so she pulled him into a room and made him transfer money to her immediately. I lay still. Every word of his felt like pulling another veil over the house I had lived in for 8 years. It turns out, beneath the appearance of a respectable family, that pride is just a debt pit silently widening every day. Min Kwan continued that once, Mrs. Lazan had taken our savings, lying that she needed to renovate the altar before Tet. I once wondered why that money disappeared so fast, but when I asked, he only said Mom needed it for something. Now I understand that money was also used to cover Thuan's debts. I'm sorry for hiding this from you, he said. His voice was hoarse. He thought he could handle it himself, but the more he hid it, the worse it got. Near this Tet, Thuan borrowed an even larger amount. Mom forced us to stay for Tet by any means, not just because she wanted the family together. She was afraid creditors would show up, afraid relatives would see, and afraid that without him there, she would have no one to lean on. I turned my face to look out the hospital window. Outside, the city lights had turned on. The night of the 29th of Tet should be when people gather around the fire, the bon chung pot, and family meals. Yet I lie here with an IV in my arm, aching from my illness and aching from realizing I was dragged into a house full of secrets without knowing. The phrase, "Don't stay here, you're bad luck," from my mother-in-law suddenly popped into my head. She wasn't really afraid I'd bring bad luck into the house. Perhaps she was just afraid that I would lie there, weak but conscious, and see all the things she was trying to hide. At that exact moment, the phone Min Kwan left on the table vibrated continuously. The screen lit up, then went dark, then lit up and went dark again. His mother's name appeared over and over again, over a dozen missed calls in just a short span of time. Min Kwan looked at the screen, his jaw tightening. I thought he would answer, but he just quietly hung up, turned the phone face down on the table, and pulled the blanket over me. "Go to sleep," he whispered. "I'll handle whatever is going on over there from now on. No one will disturb you again tonight." I closed my eyes, listening to the IV drip steadily by my ear, but in my heart, I knew the silence of that phone wasn't the end. It was just a brief lull before the real storm arrived. On the morning of the first day of Tet, I woke up to the sound of lingering fireworks from New Year's Eve echoing from afar outside my hospital window. The pale, chilly New Year's sunlight filtered through the thin curtain, landing on the back of my hand still taped to an IV. My fever had gone down and my head wasn't spinning like the day before, but my whole body felt exhausted. Just lifting my arm felt as weary as having survived a long storm. I opened my eyes, and the first thing I saw was Min Kwan slumped over the edge of the bed, his coat still on. He must have stayed up almost the entire night. As soon as I stirred slightly, he woke up immediately. His eyes were bloodshot, but his voice was remarkably gentle. "Are you awake? Are you still having trouble breathing? I bought some porridge. Let me help you up to eat a little so you can take your medicine." He opened the container of hot porridge on the table, and the scent of scallions and minced meat wafted through the room, which was filled with the smell of antiseptic. I wanted to hold the spoon myself, but my hand was still weak and trembled as soon as I lifted it. Min Kwan said nothing, just quietly blew on each spoonful to cool it before feeding me. In 8 years of marriage, I had fed my mother-in-law when she had a toothache, cooked porridge for Thuan after he was drunk, and cared for Min Kwan when he had a fever from working late at the construction site. But it seemed no one had ever sat by my side, patiently blowing on each spoonful of porridge like that before. As the hot porridge slid down my throat, my eyes suddenly stung. It wasn't just self-pity, but because only while lying in the hospital on the first morning of Tet did I finally understand what it meant to put my health before the feast, before pride, and before what people might say. My mother walked in right after, carrying a bag of oranges and a thermos of warm water. She watched Min Kwan feed me porridge, her gaze softening slightly but still heavy. She pulled up a chair and sat down, neither scolding him nor repeating the harsh words from his family. She only said slowly, "Better late than never, Kwan. But from now on, if you want to be a husband, you must protect your wife. Don't wait until she's lying in a sickbed to realize your faults." Min Kwan put the spoon down and bowed his head for a long time. "I apologize, Mom. From now on, I will take responsibility for my own choices. I won't let V live like that anymore." I looked at my mother and then at my husband. The tiny hospital room held only the three of us, no kumquat trees in sight. No lavish feasts, no boisterous holiday greetings. Yet, strangely, it was the warmest Lunar New Year morning I'd had in years. My mother peeled oranges, Min Kwan poured water, and I sat back, watching them quietly care for me. That Tet wasn't complete in the conventional sense, but it had genuine love, not the kind that demands suffering in exchange. While things were briefly peaceful on my side of the family, chaos had begun at my husband's home. I heard about it later from Min Kwan, who heard it from a few close relatives. On the morning of the first day, Mrs. Lazan woke up later than usual because she had been too angry to sleep all night. Stepping into the kitchen, she saw everything in disarray. Vegetables unpicked, broth left unboiled, chicken unprepared, and snacks still in their bags. These were the things I used to quietly finish early every year. Without me, they now appeared as a chaotic mess before her eyes. Relatives began arriving to offer their New Year greetings. Mrs. Lazan was used to showing off a tidy house and a full table. Yet that day, the altar had only a hastily arranged plate of fruit, the living room was dusty, and the kitchen smelled of grease and cold food. Someone asked, "Where is V, sister? She's usually so quick and helpful every year." She forced a smile, adjusted her collar, and replied quite naturally, "She was so sick. I let her go back to her parents' house to rest for a few days. You have to show some care for your daughter-in-law, after all." The statement sounded polite enough, but anyone who knew her temperament understood she was trying to save face. It was just a pity that Thuan didn't know how to hold his tongue. On the afternoon of the first day of Tet, after a few drinks, he lounged back in his chair, let out a dry chuckle, and dropped a remark in front of the relatives. "Sick? What sick?" V was kicked out by Mother. Mother said she was bad luck for the holiday. The whole table suddenly went silent. A great aunt set down her chopsticks and looked at Mrs. Lazan with an awkward expression. Some pretended to cough, others glanced at one another. No one said anything directly, but the gossip began to spread like oil on water. Mrs. Lazan turned purple and snapped at Thuan to shut up, but the words once spoken could not be taken back. The reputation she had guarded for years had been torn open by the very child she spoiled the most. By the afternoon of the first day of the year, while guests were still lingering, 2 strange men suddenly appeared at the front gate. They were dressed plainly, making no noise, but with icy expressions. They walked into the house as if they knew exactly where they were going. One looked around and asked, "Is Pham Thuan home?" Mrs. Lazan became immediately alert, forcing a smile. "What do you gentlemen need him for?" "It's Tet today, he's out visiting friends." The taller man pulled a folded paper from his pocket, placed it squarely on the tea table, and spoke in a mocking tone, promising to pay by the end of the year and then hiding won't work. We didn't come to celebrate Tet, we came to collect money. The atmosphere in the crowded living room suddenly turned frigid. Mrs. Lazan hurried to grab the paper to hide it, but the other man continued, loud enough for the relatives to hear, "There's the loan paper with Thuan's signature. And read this line carefully, ma'am." Her hands trembled as she opened the paper. Her eyes landed on the final note, and her face, flushed from alcohol and anger, suddenly turned deathly pale. It clearly stated that if the payment was overdue, the collateral would be the house she was living in. According to the verbal commitment and the borrower's confirmation, she stood frozen. Thuan had always claimed he was just borrowing a little money for business. He had never mentioned he'd use the entire house as bait. The relatives sat around, no one daring to breathe loudly. A strange man tapped his fingers on the table, his voice still cold. "Tell him to come back. Don't make us have to return again on the second day of Tet." On the night of the first day of Tet, Min Kwan's phone began to ring incessantly. One call, two calls, then many more from his mother. But he looked at me, asleep after taking my medicine, and ultimately didn't answer. He just took the phone out to the hallway, muted it, and stood silently for a long time. Perhaps he guessed something had happened, but this time he didn't rush back to clean up the mess as he did every other year. On the morning of the second day of Tet, as I opened my eyes, both my phone and Min Kwan's lit up at almost the same time. Mrs. Lazan's name appeared continuously. 10 calls, 20 calls, then nearly 50 missed calls in just one morning. I looked at the screen, a strange feeling rising within me. It was no longer fear like before, but a premonition that a real storm had begun to descend upon the house I had just left. I watched the phone screen light up and go dark, dark, and then light up again, a nameless feeling deep in my heart. Outside the hospital hallway, patients' families walked by quietly, everyone exchanging brief New Year greetings. But in my small room, the ringing of the phone echoed repeatedly, making the atmosphere stifling. Nearly 50 missed calls from Mrs. Lazan, a woman who spent her whole life valuing face over human connection. If she hadn't been backed into a corner, she surely wouldn't have lowered herself to call me that many times. Min Kwan stood by the window, holding his phone, the screen also filled with a list of missed calls from his mother. He looked at it for a moment, then locked the phone, his voice sinking. "Something must be wrong with Thuan again over there." I leaned back against the pillow. My body was still tired, but my mind was clearer than yesterday. I whispered, "If it were just people coming to collect debts, your mother would have called since last night. Calling so urgently from this morning, I'm afraid it's not that simple." Min Kwan hadn't had a chance to answer when his phone vibrated again. This time it wasn't my mother-in-law, but Aunt Han, a relative on his father's side whom I used to meet occasionally at funerals or anniversaries. Min Kwan looked at the caller ID, frowned slightly, and picked up the phone. As soon as he pressed the phone to his ear, his expression shifted. On the other end, Ms. Han's voice was frantic with panic. "Kwan, where are you? Something terrible has happened at home. The police arrived early this morning. They've already taken Thuan away for questioning." Hearing the word police, a cold chill ran down my spine. Min Kwan jumped up and pressed, "Please, explain clearly. What happened to Thuan? Why did the police come to the house?" Ms. Han spoke rapidly. The noise in the background echoed through the phone, a mix of crying and chatter. "Last night, some people came to collect debts, arguing at the gate at first before pulling into the living room. I was afraid the neighbors would hear, so I closed the door, but the situation only escalated." Min Kwan gripped the phone tightly. I could see his knuckles turning white. Ms. Han continued, saying that among the people demanding money was a man who had been scammed in a used car deal months ago. That person recognized Thuan the moment he saw him. It turns out Thuan had previously taken deposits from many people to buy cars, promising cheap prices and full documentation. But after taking the money, he kept stalling and never delivered. When pressured to pay back, Thuan claimed the cars were stuck in storage or delayed by paperwork, then slowly cut off all contact. People just thought he was avoiding his debts. Ms. Han choked up, adding that last night they realized he was one of the people involved in a used car fraud ring. They called for more people to come over. Someone reported it to the police right in the middle of the night. This morning, the police came to take him to the station. The whole house is in total chaos. I lay on the hospital bed, my heart pounding wildly. What Min Kwan told me last night about Thuan's debts was only the tip of the iceberg. There was something much bigger behind it. I looked at my husband and saw his face drained of all color. Even though he was disappointed in his brother, he probably never thought Thuan would go as far as getting involved in fraud. Min Kwan asked quietly, as if still clinging to a glimmer of hope. Is it possible there's been a mistake, Ms. Han? There was a brief silence on the other end, then Ms. Han replied, I wish it were a mistake too, but the police brought a warrant, and there were reports from the people who lost their money. They read out names, phone numbers, and even the bank accounts where the money was sent. Fuat couldn't even stand, his face drained of all color. His mother kept fainting and waking up, crying that people were trying to harm her son. Min Kwan closed his eyes. I know he is hurting. People can be angry at a sibling, scold them, or be disappointed in them, but hearing that your brother was taken by the police on the second day of Tet is still a heavy blow. He asked further, before they left, did Thuan say anything? Ms. Han sighed, her voice full of both pity and exhaustion. He was screaming. He told his mother she had to call you to save him, or else the whole family would be finished. He even said you were the only one with money and a house who could take care of this. That last sentence left both me and Min Kwan in silence. The word save in Thuan's mouth doesn't mean saving someone by making them face the truth. It means saving him with money, with a house, and with the sacrifices of others. Just like all the times before, the only difference is that this hole is too deep now. A few tens or hundreds of millions can no longer fill it. Min Kwan hung up and stood silently by the window for a long time. Outside, the second day Tet sunlight fell on the hospital courtyard, pale and cold. I looked at his back, clearly seeing his shoulders tense as if he were carrying a giant boulder. I know that even though he just firmly left his family home with me, that is still his mother and his own brother. A thoughtful person cannot just hear such terrible news and turn their back as if they were strangers. I softly called out to him, Kwan. He turned around, his eyes red but still trying to remain calm. I said slowly, go back and check on the situation, but remember you are going to understand the story and handle it properly, not to take the blame for him. Min Kwan stepped over to sit by the bed and took my hand. You are still sick. I don't want to leave you alone. I shook my head. My mother is here already. Besides, if you don't go back, things will only get more chaotic over there. But you must promise me one thing. He looked at me, and I spoke every word clearly. Don't sign anything. Don't send money to anyone, and don't rush to sell the house or take out loans just because someone says they care about mom or my brother. Anything involving the law must be left for the law to clarify. Min Kwan bowed his head for a long time, then nodded. I promise. But just as he finished speaking, my phone buzzed again. This time it was a message from an unknown number, containing only one line. Are you Kwan's wife? If you don't want your husband's family to be truly ruined, tell him not to go back alone. I stared at those words, a chill running down my spine. Min Kwan read them too, and neither of us spoke, but we both understood that Thuan's situation was no longer a simple debt collection case. Behind Mrs. Lazan's panic calls and Thuan's cries for help, there was perhaps a much bigger secret waiting to be exposed that second day of Tet. The storm I had sensed earlier had finally struck that house. I reread the message from the stranger one more time. Do not let him go back alone. Just 6 short words, yet they made the already cold hospital room feel even colder. Min Kwan stood by the bed, staring intently at the screen, his face tense. Quote, I knew he was torn. On one side, there was me, still weak and just recovering from a high fever. On the other, his own mother had called nearly 50 times, and his brother had been summoned by the police. His entire family was in chaos on the second day of Tet. Finally, he said he would go back, but told me to stay at the hospital with mom and not to follow him since I wasn't well yet. I looked at him and shook my head, saying I would go with him. Min Kwan frowned, intending to object, but I grabbed his wrist. I'm not going back to argue. I'm going to see for myself what is actually happening. Besides, that person said, don't go back alone, and I don't feel safe letting you walk into that situation by yourself. He looked at me for a long time, his eyes filled with both worry and helplessness. Finally, he just sighed. All right, I'll ask the doctor to let you out for a few hours, but if you get tired, we're coming back immediately. My mother wasn't happy at all when she found out. As she folded my coat for me, she gave Min Kwan a stern warning. I am letting my daughter go with you, not so she can endure another harsh word. If anything happens, you step in first. Don't let her bear the brunt of it. Min Kwan bowed his head. I understand. I will protect V. My mother looked at him, her voice softer but still stern. Protecting her isn't just saying so. When your family is wrong, you must dare to say it is wrong. On the way to my husband's house, the streets on the second day of Tet were still bustling. On both sides of the road, chrysanthemums, kumquat trees, and red lanterns hung before doorways. Children in new clothes followed adults to pay Tet visits. But inside the car, no one spoke much. Min Kwan drove very slowly, occasionally turning to look at me. I rested my head against the window, my body still tired but my mind unusually clear. I am no longer the terrified daughter-in-law who was kicked out of the house on the 29th of Tet. I am returning to that place with a different feeling, both guarded and wanting to clearly see the deep rift that has silently existed in that family. As the car stopped at the gate, I saw that the house, usually filled with lively music during Tet, was now frighteningly quiet. The gate wasn't fully closed. In the yard, several pairs of sandals were scattered, and a few members of the Hang family stood huddled together whispering. On the porch steps, Mrs. Lazan sat on the ground, her hair disheveled, her red velvet dye wrinkled since morning, her face pale as if she had aged 10 years in just one night. Seeing Min Kwan enter, she sprang up and rushed toward him, no longer with her usual arrogant, loud-voiced demeanor. She grabbed his hands and suddenly collapsed to her knees in the middle of the yard. All the relatives around were stunned. I also froze in place. The woman who once pointed at my face, cursed me as a jinx, and told me to get out, was now kneeling right in front of her son, crying until her voice distorted, "Kwan, save your younger brother, I beg you, only you can save him." Min Kwan panicked and bent down to help her up. "Mom, get up first, tell me clearly what happened." But she kept clutching his hands tightly, tears and snot streaming down her face. "He is still young, he is foolish, he looks up to you. If you don't save him, who will? I am only counting on you now." Min Kwan gritted his teeth, his voice choked up. "You must tell the truth, Mom. What has Thuan done? How much does he owe? And who is he involved with?" Mrs. Lazan dodged the question, repeating that Thuan had been led astray by bad friends, that he was just a bit reckless, and that people were pressuring him. But this time, Min Kwan was no longer easily swayed by those words. He helped her sit down on the living room sofa and said very slowly, "If you hide one more word from me, I will walk away immediately. If you want my help, you must be honest from now on." That sentence seemed to sever the final thread she was using to cover things up. Trembling, she pulled a stack of papers from the drawer. There were loan agreements, bank transfer records, and several vehicle deposit receipts, all with names linked to Thuan. I looked at the numbers on the papers, and a chill ran down my spine. 50 million, 80 million, 120 million, and even one amount reaching 300 million. It wasn't one person, it wasn't two people. There were so many different names. A cousin standing nearby sighed and said, "Kwan, the police said just a rough estimate is already over 2 billion. Thuan had been taking deposits from people to buy used cars. He promised them liquidated vehicles at low prices with full paperwork. At first, he delivered one or two to gain trust, then he collected money from many others and vanished. People traced the account that received the money, and it was his." Min Kwan stood frozen in shock. He turned to his mother, his voice raspy. "You told me he only owed a few $100 million because of business losses." Mrs. Lazan covered her face and sobbed. "At first, that was true. Then he said he just needed a bit more money to turn things around. I believed him. He said if he didn't pay in time, people would beat him up, and they would post it online to humiliate our entire family. I was so scared." I looked at her, my heart no longer filled with the anger I felt on the 29th, but rather a much deeper coldness. Her fear of losing face had nurtured Thuan's mistakes, little by little. Min Kwan asked again, each word hitting the floor like a weight, "Where did all that money go?" No one answered. A long while later, a cousin spoke quietly. "The police said he started by betting on soccer. Then after losing so much, he turned to trading virtual currency with groups online, hoping to break even, but the more he tried, the more he lost." The living room went silent. The tray of Tet treats sat on the table, untouched by anyone. Min Kwan took a step back, gripping the back of the chair. His younger brother, whom he once scolded for being lazy and reckless, had actually dragged the entire family into an abyss deeper than anyone could imagine. At that very moment, Mrs. Lazan suddenly looked up, her voice trembling violently. "I sold it, Kwan." Min Kwan frowned. "Sold what?" She burst into tears. "The ancestral land back in the village. I sold it secretly months ago to pay off his debts. I thought paying it off that one time would be the end of it. Who would have guessed? Who would have thought he still had so many other debts?" Hearing that, my whole body turned ice cold. That ancestral land was once spoken of by Mrs. Lazan as the most sacred thing of the family. She once scolded me just because I dared to suggest renting it out to get money for house repairs. Yet, for Thuan, she quietly sold it off without telling anyone. Min Kwan looked at his mother, his lips moving but no words coming out. On his face at that moment was not just anger, but the pain of a son realizing his mother had gone too far in shielding a wayward child. I stood behind him, my hand gripping the back of the chair to keep my balance. My lingering fever made me feel dizzy, yet everything before me was cruelly clear. It turns out the Tet that Mrs. Lazan tried so hard to keep up for the sake of the family's reputation had been hollowed out from within long ago. And those 50 calls on the second day of Tet were not because she missed me, nor were they out of regret for driving me away. It was the cry for help from someone who just realized the pit she dug to cover for her youngest son had finally collapsed beneath the whole family. No one in the living room could say another word after Mrs. Lazan's confession. The ancestral land was sold, the money was gone, and Thuan had been taken away to work. A Tet that Mrs. Lazan had painted with lavish feasts and boasting before relatives ended up with nothing but sighs and debt papers scattered across the table. Min Kwan stood still, his eyes fixed on the pile of files as if staring into a bottomless pit. I sat down on the chair by the door, trying to steady my breathing. My fever hadn't fully broken, making me feel hot and cold by turns. But what chilled me most at that moment wasn't the illness, but my mother-in-law's gaze. After a few minutes of crying, she suddenly looked up at Min Kwan with a very different expression. No longer just panic, but the look of someone who had spotted a final lifeline and was determined to cling to it at any cost. She slowly stood up, wiped her tears with her sleeve, and said in a hoarse voice, "Kwan, I know you're angry, and I know I was wrong to hide it from you, but now is not the time for blame. Your brother is in their hands. If we don't have the money to fix this, his whole life will be ruined." Min Kwan looked at his mother without responding, as she stepped closer to him, her voice softening into a plea. "Sell your house, the two of you, let's save Thuan first. A house lost can be earned back. If your brother goes to prison, his life is over." The entire living room fell silent. A relative standing near the altar let out a soft gasp. "Sister Zan," she started, then fell quiet. Perhaps even she couldn't believe my mother-in-law could make such a request right in front of me, the person she had kicked out of the house just 2 days ago, while I was burning with a high fever. I looked at Mrs. Lazan, and my heart turned completely cold. The house she was referring to wasn't just some object to be bartered away. It was the home my husband and I had paid off penny by penny, saving every bit, working weekends, skipping trips and plans to finally own. Min Kwan stood still, and thinking he was wavering, Mrs. Lazan pressed on, "You are the eldest, your father passed early, this family relies on you. Thuan was foolish, but you can't abandon your own flesh and blood. Just sell the house, pay them a portion, and we'll ask for more time for the rest. Quote, you two are young and capable, you can start over later, just save your brother first." Every word of "start over" landed in my ears like a heavy stone. I remember all these years, every time I wanted to spend money on myself, my mother-in-law called me wasteful. Every time I mentioned renovating our small apartment, she insisted I had to prioritize my husband's family affairs. Yet now, regarding our greatest asset, you can calmly tell us to sell it just because Thuan caused trouble. I didn't say a word. I wanted to hear Min Kwan's response. There are boundaries that, if a husband doesn't stand up to protect them, no matter how much a wife speaks, it will only sound selfish. Min Kwan suddenly let out a faint laugh, a laugh not of joy, but so painful that the whole room fell silent. He looked up at his mother, his eyes red, but his voice clearer than ever. "You say that if the house is lost, it can be earned back. Then why didn't you say a word to me when you sold the Hongwa land? Why, when Thuan was taking out one loan after another, didn't you make him stop? Why is it that only when there's nothing left to hide, you remember that I am the eldest son?" Mrs. Lazan froze, her lips trembling. "Mom, it was also out of love for my brother." Min Kwan stepped up to the table and slammed his hand down on the wood. The dry thud startled the relatives. "If you loved my brother, you should have used his own life to teach him right from wrong. Why did you use my wife's and my life to patch up his mistakes?" He turned to look at me for a moment, then faced his mother again. "Do you know that on the 29th of Tet, you kicked V out of the house when she had a 41-degree fever? Did you think of me then? Did you think about how I would live if something had happened to her on the road?" Mrs. Lazan was struck dumb. I saw her hands trembling. Min Kwan did not stop. All his years of silence seemed to shatter in that moment. You said V was a jinx, that she was bad luck. But the person who made this house what it is today is not V. It is Thuan who was wrong. Yet you knew he was wrong and still covered for him. Now that he's caused trouble, you expect my wife and me to sell our home to shoulder it. Do you call that family love? An uncle sitting in the corner of the room sighed. Kwan is not wrong, Sister Zon. Even saving someone requires a method. You cannot push another family into the abyss just to pull someone up who jumped in on their own. Mrs. Lazan turned sharply, her eyes full of resentment, but in front of so many people, she no longer had enough arguments to refute him. The silence of the relatives now was no longer on her side. It was the silence of people who had seen everything too clearly. She turned back to me, her voice sharpening. V, tell me, you're his wife, don't you care about your brother-in-law? Do you have to see this family destroyed to be satisfied? In the past, that question would have made me tremble, and I would have rushed to explain that I didn't mean it. I wouldn't dare. But that day, I just put my hand on my chest, took a slow breath, and replied, I don't want this family to be destroyed, Mother, but I cannot allow my husband's and my house to be sold to pay for mistakes I did not cause. Quote. I looked straight at her, my voice not loud but clear enough for everyone to hear. If Thuan needs a lawyer or someone to guide him in dealing with the authorities, we will discuss it. If you need someone to take you to meet the victims to find a legal remedy, I won't stop Kwan, but selling the house, borrowing more money, or signing papers to cover Thuan's debts is out of the question. Min Kwan immediately stood by my side as a way to make his choice clear. He said, this opinion is my opinion as well. Mrs. Lazan looked at the two of us, her pleading gaze turning to resentment, but this time Min Kwan did not back down. He picked up the stack of loan papers on the table, straightened them, and said, from now on, everything must be clear. Which debts are legal, and what is the extent of the responsibility? Let the lawyers and the authorities handle it. I am not abandoning you, Mother, but I also won't let you use the concept of filial piety to force me to do wrong. Quote, those words fell into the middle of the cluttered living room like a knife cutting through a string of manipulation that had lasted for years. Mrs. Lazan slumped into her chair, her face deathly pale, for the first time having no words left to scold. As for me, in my exhaustion, I suddenly felt a weight lift, not because everything was resolved, but because Min Kwan finally stood firmly by his wife's side, while still being rational enough not to cruelly turn his back on his mother. Mrs. Lazan hadn't been slumped in her chair for long before her expression changed again. Perhaps when she realized she couldn't force Min Kwan to sell the house, and couldn't use filial piety to make him take on Thuan's burdens, she began to look for another place to vent her despair. And that place, as it has been for so many years, was me. She snapped her head up, her bloodshot eyes staring at me as if all the debt papers, the victims of fraud, Thuan's mistakes, and her own enabling could be gathered and dumped onto the head of a daughter-in-law who had just recovered from a fever. She pointed a finger straight at my face, her voice hoarse but full of bitterness. It all started the day you stepped foot into this house. Before that, my family was peaceful. Since you arrived, it's been one disaster after another. You really are the kind of woman who brings bad luck to the doorstep. The whole living room went silent. Min Kwan immediately stepped forward, but I gently held his arm back. I wanted to hear it all. There are words that, unless allowed to spill out, outsiders will never understand why a daughter-in-law could be in enough pain to leave the house she once tried so hard to build. Seeing me silent, Mrs. Lazan felt emboldened. She jumped to her feet, crying and shrieking, her voice echoing through the living room. If you hadn't thrown a tantrum on the 29th of Tet and dragged Kwan away, he would have been here on the first day of the new year. If creditors came, someone would have been there to talk. If the police came, someone would have handled it. You were the one who dragged your husband away, leaving us mother and son abandoned. Are you still standing there acting like you have no part in this? Saying this, she turned to our relatives as if looking for allies. Everyone look. What kind of daughter-in-law sees her husband's family in trouble and just stands by with folded arms? She wants my family destroyed. A few ignorant relatives started whispering, one saying, regardless, it's the husband's family business. Them leaving right at that moment really looks bad. Another sighed, women should sometimes be a bit more yielding. Being too rigid is why the family ends up in this mess. I heard every word clearly, but strangely, this time, my heart was no longer trembling as it used to. Perhaps when someone has been pushed to the brink of humiliation, they learn how to stand still amidst the noise. Min Kwan couldn't take it anymore. He turned to those who had just spoken, his voice heavy. My wife had a 41-degree fever, and the doctor said her life could have been in danger. My mother kicked her out of the house, claiming she was cursed. I took my wife to the hospital. Is that wrong? The room immediately quieted down, but Mrs. Lazan did not stop. She slammed her hand on the table. Tears streamed down, yet her words were sharp as knives. What do you know? Ever since you married her, you've completely changed. In the past, you loved your mother and your brother. Now, just because your wife says something, you turn your back on your own blood. If that's not her inciting you, what is? I looked at her, suddenly feeling both hurt and amused. A mother who, out of misguided love, covers for one child time after time, yet calls the other child's sanity the result of his wife's manipulation. I didn't rush to answer. I slowly took my phone out of my pocket. My hand was still shaking a little because I was weak, but my mind was very clear. I opened the recording folder and found a file saved months ago. That file was not something I intentionally recorded to harm Thuan. That day, he was drunk in the backyard, laughing and talking loudly on the phone. I happened to overhear it and started recording because I felt uneasy. I placed the phone on the tea table and pressed play. At first, there was only the sound of wind and clinking glasses, then Thuan's slurred voice came through clearly. Those guys are so easy to fool. Just tell them it's an internal liquidation car and they need a deposit to hold it. They're all just greedy for a bargain. Some even thanked me profusely. Once I gather one more batch, I'll clean out everything. Another man's voice in the recording asked, what if they come looking for their money? Thuan sneered. What's there to fear? At worst, my mom will handle it. She won't let me die. My brother Quan has a house and money. He'll have to save me one way or another. The living room fell dead silent. No one whispered anymore. Those who had just criticized me for being too soft or too hard all lowered their heads. Mrs. Lazan stood frozen, her face as pale as paper. That was her son's voice. There was no mistaking it. A drunken, arrogant, irresponsible voice, yet sober enough to calculate that his mother would cover for him and his brother would bear the burden. Looking at her, I felt no real satisfaction. I only felt a chill down my spine. A person who does wrong while knowing they always have a safety net will never stop on their own. The recording continued. Thuan added, my mom controls everything in this house. My sister-in-law is only good for the kitchen. What does she know about money? Whatever the issue, just let me say the word, and Quan will soften right up. At those words, Min Quan closed his eyes. I knew that sentence cut him very deep. It not only exposed Thuan's true nature but also the weakness that allowed him to be used by others. I stopped the recording. The click was faint, yet it sounded like a bolt locking in the room. I looked up at each person and said slowly, I didn't play this to push Thuan into a corner. I played it so everyone understands that this didn't start on the 29th of Tet, nor when my husband and I left the house. It began a long time ago, from when one person did wrong and the whole family took turns covering for him. Ms. Lazan's lips trembled. When did you record that? Have you been spying on your brother-in-law? I looked straight at her. If I hadn't heard that sentence that day, perhaps today I would be just like many people here, thinking Thuan is just a reckless kid pushed into a dead end. But no, mother. He knows what he's doing, and he knows for sure that someone will save him. My voice wasn't loud, but every word was so clear that even I felt my heart grow cold. I placed the phone on the table, my hand tightening slightly. The person who makes this family suffer isn't me, not because I got sick on Tet, and not because I followed my husband when we were kicked out. The one making this family suffer is the person who always condones wrongdoing, calling a cover-up love, calling forcing others to bear the consequences family affection. As the last sentence ended, Ms. Lazan stumbled and gripped the back of her chair. For the first time in front of the relatives, she couldn't find a single word to scold me with. Min Quan stood beside me, speaking only after a long silence. His voice was hoarse, but firm. From now on, if anyone still says my wife is the reason this family is in this state, please listen to that recording again. I will not let V be falsely blamed ever again. No one answered. In the room that once echoed with accusations against me, the silence at that moment was the clearest admission of all. And I knew from that moment on, the label of bad luck daughter-in-law that Mrs. Lazan tried to stick on me was finally ripped off by the very voice of her favorite child. After that recording, everyone thought everything was clear. Thuan was the troublemaker, Mrs. Lazan was the concealer, and my husband and I were just people dragged into a mess we didn't create. But life often doesn't stop where people think they've hit rock bottom. There are pits that look knee-deep at first, but taking one more step reveals an abyss below. On the afternoon of the second day of Tet, while we were sitting together gathering all the documents on the table, a car suddenly pulled up outside the gate. It wasn't the noisy sound of relatives coming for Tet greetings, nor the hurried footsteps of creditors. It was the sound of a car pulling up neatly in front of the gate. Then a woman over 50 stepped out. She wore a dark brown coat, her hair in a low bun, with a stern but not unkind face. In her hands, she clutched a thick stack of files carefully tied with a rubber band. The first person to recognize her was Mrs. Lazan. The moment she saw that woman, my mother-in-law's face changed color. She stood up abruptly, stuttering, "Ms. Hong, why are you here?" The woman named Hong didn't answer right away. She walked into the living room, glanced around at me, Min Kwan, and a few relatives, then stopped at the pile of debt papers on the table. Her eyes didn't look surprised, as if she had already guessed this house would sooner or later end up like this. Min Kwan stood up politely. "Hello, ma'am. Who are you looking for?" Ms. Hong looked at him for a long time before asking, "You are Min Kwan, aren't you?" He nodded. She placed the stack of files on the table, her voice strangely calm. "I came to find you. I am not one of Thuan's creditors, nor am I someone he scammed with a car deposit. But if I don't speak today, perhaps your mother will continue to hide half the truth." That statement made the entire living room, which had just settled down, tense up like a guitar string again. Mrs. Lazan hurriedly stepped forward to grab Mrs. Hong's arm. "Hong, my house is in chaos today. Can we talk about this after Tet?" Mrs. Hong pulled her hand away, gently but firmly. "I have let things slide too many times already. Zan, every time you say after Tet, after the anniversary. After Thuan settles down, but look, is there any after left?" My mother-in-law stood frozen in her tracks. Min Kwan frowned, his voice slowing down. "Could you please clarify that for me?" Mrs. Hong opened a folder, placing papers on the table one by one, chillingly neat, including loan document copies, transfer receipts, handwritten commitments, and debt notes signed by more than just Thuan. I glanced over and saw Mrs. Lazan's name appearing on many pages, not just once or twice. Mrs. Hong said, "A few years ago, I acted as an intermediary for a small investment group in our old business circle. At first, Zan came to borrow a few tens of millions, saying it was to renew a bank loan. Out of personal courtesy, I helped introduce her. After that, Thuan started borrowing separately with his mother acting as guarantor. Every time she was near bankruptcy, Zan would come asking for extensions or new loans to cover the old ones." She paused and looked straight at Min Kwan. "The amount everyone is talking about, over 2 billion, is just the part reported in the used car case. But the total of revolving loans, high-interest loans, and personal loans, including accrued interest, has exceeded 5 billion. The air in the room seemed to freeze. 5 billion. That number fell in the middle of Tet like a lightning bolt. I saw Min Kwan step back, his hands gripping the edge of the table. Mrs. Lazan trembled, her lips pale, but she still tried to defend herself. "No, it's not that much. You calculated it wrong. There are debts I have already paid off." Mrs. Hong nodded, her voice not harsh but every word sharp. "You paid, but you paid with new loans. You pay off one place only to open another. You think you are saving your son, but you are actually just dragging more people down." Min Kwan picked up a paper bearing his mother's signature, along with a line confirming a payment guarantee should Thuan become unable to pay. He stared at the paper for a long time before asking, "Did you really sign these, mother?" Mrs. Lazan did not answer. That silence was heavier than any confession. Min Kwan turned to Mrs. Hong, his voice raspy. "Have you ever spoken to my mother about this?" Mrs. Hong sighed. "Not just once. I even came to this house, stood at the gate, and called Zan out to talk. I told her to stop, to have Thuan turn himself in, or at least tell the truth to the family. But every time, Zan would just cry and say that as long as she kept her son out of prison, it would be enough. She feared losing face, feared the relatives finding out, feared people saying her family had a wayward child, but the more she feared and covered it up, the deeper Thuan sank into trouble." I looked at my mother-in-law. She could no longer find the strength to scold. Her face was wrinkled, her hands clutching her shirt as if trying to tear herself apart. Only now did I understand why she had called us like a madwoman on the second day of Tet. It wasn't just because Thuan had been summoned by the police, nor just because of the debt collectors. It was because the secret she had buried for years had finally been brought into the living room by an outsider and laid bare before everyone's eyes. Mrs. Hong took out the final document and placed it in front of Min Quan. I didn't come here to force you to pay the money. I know this isn't your and your wife's responsibility if you haven't signed anything or accepted a guarantee. I came so you would know where your mother stands and so she would stop using the bond of family to drag you down with her. If you want to save someone, you must first face the truth. That statement left me choked up. An outsider understood the boundaries better than those living under this roof. Min Quan held the paper, his hand trembling ever so slightly. He looked at his mother, his eyes bloodshot. Mother, I used to think you were Thuan's victim, but it turns out you weren't just deceived by him. You were helping him deceive everyone else. Mrs. Lazan burst into tears, but this time, her crying no longer moved anyone to pity. It sounded like the collapse of a mother who had just been forced to face the mistake she had raised. I stood beside Min Quan, placing my hand gently on his arm, not to stop his pain, for no one could stop that, but to remind him not to let that pain lead him to a wrong decision. In the living room, the papers lay spread out on the table like shards of the so-called respectable family that Mrs. Lazan had once been proud of. And I understood, from the moment Mrs. Hong walked in, that everything had taken a turn. It was no longer about whether to save Thuan or not, but how to stop this family from lying before we were all dragged into the abyss. The moment Mrs. Hong left the house, the air seemed to have been sucked out of the living room. The papers she left behind remained on the table, neat and cold, needing no further accusation. Mrs. Lazan collapsed into her chair, her eyes staring blankly into the space before her. The relatives no longer dared to utter a word of judgment. Everyone understood that this matter had gone far beyond just the debts of a wayward youngest son. It was the result of years of concealment, years of using a mother's tears to cover up a child's mistakes. Mrs. Lazan muttered to herself, "I only wanted to save your brother. I only wanted to give him a chance to live." Her voice was so soft that if the living room hadn't been so silent, no one would have heard her. Min Quan stood before his mother, his eyes red and swollen. He loved his mother, I knew that. No matter how harsh she was to me, she was still the one who gave birth to him, the one who raised both brothers alone after his father passed away. But love does not mean turning a blind eye, and there are truths that hurt more the longer you avoid them. Min Quan slowly sat down across from her. He no longer shouted or slammed the table. Perhaps the initial anger had passed, leaving only a deep, profound pain. He said, "Mother, saving someone once is love, but saving them to the point of masking wrong as right is no longer love, it is harming them." Mrs. Lazan looked up at her son, tears streaming down her cheeks. She tried to retort, but her lips trembled without making a sound. For the first time, Min Quan's words were not meant to blame her, but rather to hold up a mirror before her. I stood by the tea cabinet, my hand resting lightly on the back of a chair to keep my balance. My body was still weak, but my mind was perfectly clear. If I had interrupted to blame her then, bringing up how she called me a jinx, or recounting the humiliation of the 29th of Tet, no one could have said I was wrong. But I knew that scolding someone in a panic only makes them retreat into defensiveness. To solve this, she must have no more excuses to hide behind her tears. I quietly said to Min Quan, "Come outside with me for a moment." He looked at me with a bit of surprise, then nodded. The two of us stepped out to the small yard on the side of the house. The wind of the second day of Tet blew by, chilling and cold. The scent of incense from the altar inside drifted out, sharp and musky. Min Quan stood silently, hands clasped together, his voice husky as he said he didn't know what else to do. Quote, I can't bear to abandon my mother, but if I let her drag me into this, I fear I'll just keep making mistakes." I looked at him and saw in his eyes the exhaustion of a son caught between filial duty and what is right. I said slowly, "We won't abandon his mother, but we also won't sell the house, take on debt, or sign anything to pay off Thuan's debts. You must clearly distinguish between helping your mother get through her panic and helping her evade the consequences." Min Quan looked at me for a long time. Perhaps that was exactly what he needed to hear to keep himself grounded. I continued, "If you soften your heart now and sell the house or hand over money to those people, it won't end there. Thuan will learn that no matter how big a disaster he causes, his brother will always be there to carry the burden. Your mother will learn that if she cries long enough, we will eventually back down. And what about the victims? They have truly lost their money, and they have truly lost their trust. We cannot save our loved ones by trampling on justice for others." Min Quan bowed his head, took a very deep breath, and then nodded. He understood now. This time, we have to do what is right. Though it pained me, I squeezed his hand gently. Doing the right thing does not mean being heartless. We will still find a lawyer, still protect your mother's legal rights, and still guide Thuan on how to testify if he is willing to cooperate. But each person must be held accountable for their own mistakes. When we returned to the living room, Mrs. Lazan was still sitting there, her eyes red and swollen. The relatives fell silent as soon as we entered. Min Kwan pulled up a chair, stacked all the papers neatly, and said, "Mom, I won't sell the house, and I won't transfer money to anyone while things are still unclear. But I won't abandon you. If you really want to save Thuan, we must follow 3 conditions." Mrs. Lazan looked up quickly, her eyes filled with both hope and caution. "What conditions?" Min Kwan looked at his mother, his voice clear. "First, you must hand over all loan documents, guarantees, messages, recordings, anything related to Thuan. Don't hide a single page." Her lips trembled, but he did not let her interrupt. "Second, Thuan must confess the whole truth himself. To what extent did he cause trouble? He must admit to that much. No one in this family will take the blame for him, and you are not to sign any more papers." My mother-in-law began to tremble. "Do you want to send your brother to prison?" Min Kwan looked straight at her. "I don't want to pull him out of the hole you've been covering up for too long anymore. If he keeps lying and avoiding things, that is when he will truly have no way out." The room went silent. I saw an uncle nod slightly but say nothing. Min Kwan continued, "Third, from now on, everything must go through lawyers and authorities. No private deals with loan sharks, no cash handouts, no signing handwritten notes, and no doing reckless things because someone threatens you. You have to accept the shame, because if we keep fearing for our reputation, this whole family will lose everything." The last sentence made Mrs. Lazan bow her head. I stepped forward and placed a glass of warm water in front of her. My voice was softer but not weak. Quote, "If you still love Thuan, don't try to save him this time by lying. When someone goes down the wrong path, if there is always someone clearing a way out for them, they will never know how to turn back." Mrs. Lazan looked at the glass of water and then at me. Her lips quivered, and tears welled up again. But this time, her crying was no longer a tactic to force her son to concede. It sounded like the weeping of someone realizing for the first time that her own hands had helped push her child into the abyss. She covered her face and sobbed, "I was wrong, but I was afraid of losing him. I was so afraid of losing my son." I paused for a few seconds and replied, "The more Mom fears losing him, the more she must let Thuan face the truth about his mistakes. If you cover for him this time, Mom won't just lose Thuan. She will lose Kwan, and lose the last bit of peace this family has left." Min Kwan stood beside me without saying another word, but his hand rested gently on my shoulder. With just that small gesture, I understood he had chosen to face the situation, not by turning his back on Mom, nor by blindly saving his brother, but by finally leading the whole family out of the shadow of lies that had loomed for so long. It was late on the afternoon of the second day of Tet, while everyone was still sitting around the living room table sorting through the documents Ms. Lazan had handed over. Suddenly, a car pulled up outside the gate. This time, it wasn't relatives, nor was it Ms. Hong returning. 2 plainclothes officers, accompanied by a local policeman, stepped inside. Behind them was Thuan. The moment I saw my brother-in-law, the entire room seemed to grow tense. The man who once lounged around eating melon seeds and mocking me for being sick at the wrong time now had disheveled hair, a gaunt face, and bloodshot eyes from lack of sleep. Brought back to retrieve further documents regarding his previous transactions, as soon as he stepped through the door, he scanned the room, saw Min Kwan, and lunged forward like a drowning person grabbing a raft. Before everyone, Thuan collapsed and clutched his brother's legs, his voice breaking, "Kwan, save me, I don't want to go. Closet. I'm still young, brother, please talk to them. I only owe them money, I didn't defraud anyone." Min Kwan bent down to help Thuan up, but I could clearly see he was no longer holding his brother like he had in the past. His hand only rested lightly on Thuan's shoulder, just enough to make him stand up. There was no more unconditional protection. He looked straight at his younger brother, his voice hoarse but calm. "I am asking you one question. In total, how many people have you taken money from?" Thuan avoided his gaze, wiped his nose with his hand, and stammered, "I don't remember clearly. I was just borrowing to keep the business going. Because the cars were late and customers were pushing hard, I got stuck in a cash flow crunch, and I intended to make it back later." To everyone's surprise, Min Kwan interrupted, "I didn't ask for the reason. I asked how many people. Thuan bowed his head in silence. The silence lasted so long that an officer had to remind him that cooperation would make the verification process easier. If you continue to be evasive, we still have enough reports and bank statements to proceed. Just then, Ms. Hong returned. Perhaps she was called in to verify a few more documents regarding loans made through acquaintances. In her hand was a stack of photocopied lists. She placed it on the table and said briefly, "These are over 20 people who transferred money to Thuan as deposits for cars or capital contributions for liquidation vehicles. I don't have all the original documents, but most transactions have bank statements and messages." She flipped through the pages, revealing a dense list of names. Some deposited 50 million, some 100 million, and some as much as 300 million. I stood nearby listening to Ms. Hong, feeling my heart grow cold with every word. There was a worker who saved for a whole year to buy a small truck for hire. There was a young couple who borrowed from the bank to buy a car for ride-sharing, hoping to earn more to raise their child. There was a woman running a small eatery who transferred almost all her savings because she trusted Thuan as an acquaintance. Those people are not just numbers on paper. They are real families, real blood and tears, and people whose holidays were likely sleepless because their money was swept away. I suddenly recalled the look on Thuan's face days before, as he lounged on the sofa, complaining I was slow in the kitchen, mocking everything as if he could always rely on others to carry his burdens. It turns out that behind that arrogant facade, he had dragged so many people into misery. This is no longer just my brother-in-law being reckless, nor is it a family debt that can be settled behind closed doors. It has become a matter involving too many people. Seeing the list placed before him, Thuan began to lose his composure. He turned to Ms. Hong and shouted, "Don't add salt and pepper to the story. I told you I would pay. I'm not hiding, it's just that people were pressuring me so hard during the holidays." Quote, Ms. Hong looked at him, her voice calm. "They are pressuring you because you've been making promises from one month to the next. You took their money to gamble, and then claimed it was business. Do you still not see your own wrongdoing even now?" Quote, being pushed to such a point, Thuan suddenly turned sharply toward his mother, his eyes no longer pleading but glaring like a wounded animal. "Say something, Mom. You told me to keep trying, didn't you? You said Brother Quan had a house and money, and he'd find a way to save me. You even signed papers to help me borrow more. Why is everyone turning their backs on me now?" That statement hit Mrs. Lazan like a slap to the face. Sitting on the chair, she froze the moment she heard him, her eyes wide and her lips trembling uncontrollably. I looked at her and suddenly felt a very raw sense of pain. The son she protected to the point of selling ancestral land, hiding it from the family, scolding her daughter-in-law, and forcing her other son to sell his home. In this moment of crisis, he did not hesitate to use her as a shield. She stammered, "Thuan, everything I did was for you." Thuan sneered, his voice biting, "If it was for me, then save me. Why are you crying?" Quote, "If you can't save me, don't pretend you love me." Min Quan stood silently listening to his younger brother. I saw his eyes turn red, but he did not lose control. He stepped forward, standing between Thuan and Mrs. Lazan, his voice low. "A man who causes trouble, takes money from over 20 people, and then blames his mother when he's confronted. Who else do you want to save you?" Thuan opened his mouth to argue, but Min Quan continued, "Mom was wrong to cover for you, but you were the one who took the money, you made the promises, and you were the one who gambled it away. Stop acting like a child who was led astray." Quote, Thuan breathed heavily, his eyes bulging with rage. He looked around the room, seeing no one left on his side, and shouted, "Fine. If the family won't save me, I'll confess everything. Quote, I'll confess that Mom signed the loan papers for me, that she sold the ancestral land, and that she told me to stay quiet and let Brother Quan handle it. Don't expect any of you to have peace." Upon hearing this, Mrs. Lazan collapsed, clutching her chest with both hands. It was as if she only now truly understood that the youngest son she had pampered was ready to drag her down with him. No one in the room could say a word. Even the police officer standing nearby was silent for several seconds at the sight of a mother and son exposing each other in the middle of Tet. I stepped forward to help Mrs. Lazan sit back down, even though the wounds from her past words to me were still fresh. She gripped my wrist very tightly. Her hand was ice cold. Her eyes no longer held resentment toward me, only panic and devastation, while Thuan stood there. His face was pale and he was still panting, but his duplicity was now so apparent that no one could fool themselves into thinking he was just a foolish youngest child. That afternoon on the second day of Tet, when Thuan was taken away again, Mrs. Lazan no longer chased after him screaming like she did in the morning. She just sat still in her chair, staring at the gate, her lips moving without forming any words. Perhaps for the first time in her life, she understood that some children aren't ruined by a lack of love, but by being loved the wrong way for too long. And the price of that misguided love would not be paid by Thuan alone. After Thuan was taken away again, the house fell into a very uncomfortable silence. No one had the strength left to scold, nor was anyone in the mood to offer lucky wishes for the new year. On the table, the sweets remained untouched, the tea had gone cold, and the smell of incense from the altar mixed with the scent of wind oil made the atmosphere in the living room even heavier. Mrs. Lazan sat back in her chair, eyes fixed on the gate, her face as pale as someone who had just endured a long illness, but that silence did not last long. The story of the police coming to the house on the second day of Tet, Thuan's debts, and Mrs. Hong bringing the files, it all spread faster than the wind. Less than an hour later, relatives from the paternal side began to arrive. Some said they came to check on them, others claimed they were worried after hearing the news. But everyone's eyes were filled with curiosity. Some walked in and immediately looked around as if to see how messy the house, once boasted by Mrs. Lazan as orderly, had truly become. At first, they were cautious, only whispering a few questions to Min Quan, but as time went on, their words became harsher. An aunt-in-law slammed her gift bag onto the table, looked at Mrs. Lazan, and sighed, "Don't be angry with me, but you spoiled your son way too much. Now the karma has hit the whole family. What else could it be?" Another uncle chimed in as well. "Thuan has been rotten for a long time. Everyone saw it. Only you kept defending his wrongs, you covered for him. Now that it's out, who can you blame?" Mrs. Lazan had always feared being bad-mouthed behind her back, yet today, every accusation was being hurled directly at her. Her face turned pale, her lips quivered, but she could not argue back. Someone even brought up the ancestral land that had been sold, their voice full of rage. "You even dared to secretly sell the land left by our ancestors to pay off his debts. Did you even think about them?" Quote, as soon as those words were spoken, Mrs. Lazan clutched her chest, her breath hitched, and she swayed as if about to fall from her chair. I was standing nearby and instinctively stepped forward to support her. Her hands were ice-cold and feather-light, so unlike her usual sharp demeanor. The relatives froze, and Min Quan looked at me with eyes full of both surprise and pity. Perhaps no one expected the person she had just kicked out of the house while feverish would be the first to catch her as she fainted, but at that moment, I didn't have time to think about whether I should do it or not. Before me was simply a woman over 60 being pushed to the point of suffocation. I helped her sit up straight and poured her a glass of warm water. Then I turned to the relatives standing around the room, my voice not loud but clear enough. "I know everyone is frustrated, but the law will clarify what is right and wrong. But today, please do not push a mother to the point where she cannot breathe. Scolding her more won't help the victims get their money back, nor will it make Thuan wake up any faster." The room went silent, and a few people awkwardly looked away. The aunt who had been the harshest also pursed her lips and stopped. I understood they weren't entirely wrong for blaming Mrs. Lazan. It was her misguided protection that had contributed to pushing Thuan further away. But I also understood that if everyone kept kicking her while she was down, she would just retreat into pride and defensiveness. To make her face the truth, we must first help her maintain her last shred of composure. I turned back to look at Mrs. Lazan. She was looking at me with blurry, teary eyes, feeling both ashamed and confused. Perhaps she couldn't believe I was the one standing up to stop others from cornering her. I leaned down and whispered, just loud enough for her to hear. "Helping you sit down doesn't mean I agree to keep covering for you. I just don't want you to collapse before you can fix what needs fixing." She trembled, and tears welled up. For the first time since I married into this family, she called my name in a truly fragile voice. "V, I was wrong, wasn't I?" That question made my throat tighten. If this were a few days ago, I might have only felt satisfaction, but at that moment, seeing the woman who was once so arrogant she called me bad luck now huddled in the living room, surrounded by judgmental eyes, I only saw how pathetic life can be because of one's own stubbornness. I didn't rush to forgive her, nor did I hold her hand to comfort her as if nothing had happened. I simply replied, "If you're wrong, fix it with actions, mother, not with tears." Min Quan stepped up to stand beside me. He looked around at the relatives and said firmly, "Thank you all for your concern, but from now on, Thuan's matters will be handled according to the law. My wife and I will help mother find a lawyer to protect her legal rights if she is threatened or forced to sign papers. But I want to be clear, my wife and I will not pay off Thuan's debts, sell the house, or borrow money to cover up his wrongdoing. An uncle asked, "Then what about the people he cheated? Are we just supposed to let them lose everything?" Min Kwan looked at him, his voice dropping. "Anyone who transferred money to Thuan, or has documents or message logs, should work with the authorities to report their losses. Our family is not hiding, but if we just pay individuals separately without any legal basis, everything will only become more chaotic and we could be taken advantage of further." I added, "We will compile the information and guide everyone to contact the right places. We will take responsibility for the wrongdoings, but it must be done clearly." A few relatives nodded, and those who knew the victims softened their tone. At least there was someone in the house who made sense. An aunt sighed softly, "Let Kwan and V handle it. Making a scene won't accomplish anything." Mrs. Lazan lowered her head, holding a warm cup in both hands as tears fell, one by one, onto the back of her hands. This time, no one coaxed her, and no one scolded her further. This silence was different. It was no longer a silence to cover things up, but one for her to reflect on herself. I stood beside Min Kwan, feeling physically exhausted but strangely at peace. I know I am not noble enough to forget everything she once said to me. I am also not foolish enough to let my compassion become a rope that pulls me back into that old cycle of suffering. But even more, I do not want to turn her pain into a stage for my own retaliation. There are times when preserving a bit of someone else's dignity is not because they deserve it, but because I don't want to lose my own integrity. That afternoon, in the middle of the living room that had witnessed so many harsh words directed at me, for the first time, the gazes fixed on me were no longer the scrutinizing eyes of in-laws looking at an outsider. There was a hint of surprise, a touch of respect, and the stillness of those who understood that I did not kick Mrs. Lazan while she was at her weakest. I only pulled her up and presented her with the only path remaining: to stand up on her own, admit her wrongs, and move forward with the last of her dignity. On the night of the second day, my husband's house no longer echoed with the sound of people coming and going. Most of the relatives had left, leaving only a few pairs of slippers scattered on the porch. Nobody had even bothered to clear the tray of sweets on the table. I intended to return to the hospital with Min Kwan immediately, but the doctor said if I didn't have a fever, I could rest for a few hours, so he took me to our old room to lie down. It had been less than 3 days since I left that room. Yet, walking back in, it felt as though a lifetime had passed. I woke up in the middle of the night with a parched throat. Min Kwan had fallen asleep in the chair beside the bed, his hand still loosely clutching his phone, probably afraid of missing an urgent call. I sat up gently, put on a coat, and went down to the kitchen to get some water. The staircase was dimly lit. The house was deathly quiet, with only a faint yellow light spilling out from the altar room. I slowed my steps when I heard a very soft sobbing sound. Mrs. Lazan sat alone before the altar, her hair loose, with gray strands visible under the light, looking as if she had aged significantly overnight. In her hands was a photograph of her late husband, a man I only knew through his portrait and a few brief family stories. She clutched the frame to her chest, weeping as she confessed, "My dear, I couldn't keep this house, nor could I raise our son properly. I thought loving him meant saving him, but I ended up ruining him instead." I stood tucked by the stairs, silenced. For the first time, I did not see the bitter mother-in-law who had called me a jinx and thrown me out of the house while I was running a high fever. I only saw a mother who failed because she loved her son the wrong way, a woman who spent her life guarding her pride, only to collapse before the altar of the very family she was once proud of. I did not step forward. There are moments of pain that belong only to others. One should just stand still and let them face it on their own. On the morning of the third day, the sky was unusually gloomy. I had just finished taking my medicine when Mrs. Lazan knocked on the door. The knock was very light, completely different from the way she used to push the door open without asking. Min Kwan opened it and saw his mother standing outside, her eyes puffy, clutching an old, paint-chipped metal box. She looked at me and then at him, her voice hoarse. "Come downstairs for a moment, I have something to tell you both." In the living room, she placed the metal box on the table, the sound of metal hitting glass ringing out heavily. She unlocked it, revealing stacks of paper bound by rubber bands, a small notebook, yellowed pawn receipts, gold sale slips, loan documents from relatives, and agreements she had signed as a guarantor. She took each item out and placed it neatly before us. No more hiding, no more excuses, no more saying it was just a little bit like before. With a trembling voice, she said, "This is everything. I wrote down every debt I could remember in this notebook, and for those I couldn't recall, I've noted the lenders so you can ask them. I will go confess everything. I won't make you sell the house anymore. Min Kwan sat across from her, silent for a very long time. I saw the hand he had resting on his knee tighten. This was the first time his mother took responsibility in front of him, not using tears to pressure him, nor using the "blood is thicker than water" excuse to drag him into it. He asked softly, "Have you thought this through, Mom?" Ms. Lazan nodded. Tears fell again, but her voice was no longer trembling. "I've thought about it all night. If I keep hiding it, not only will Thuan be ruined, but you, V, and everyone he deceived will be dragged down too." Quote, "If Mom is wrong, Mom will bear her share of the blame." When mentioning my name, she hesitated for a moment and then lowered her head. "Because on the 29th of Tet, I said such terrible things to you. I'm not asking you to forget it immediately. I only ask that you let me do this one right thing." I looked at her, my heart heavy. I couldn't say, "It's all right, Mom," because it really wasn't. The words she spoke that day still felt like a burn in my heart, but looking at the metal box on the table, watching her bend down to pick up each paper that documented her own mistakes, I understood that, at the very least, she truly wanted to stop. I replied, "I won't stop you, but everything must be done correctly. You must confess the truth to make amends, not just act on emotion only to regret it later." Just then, Ms. Lazan's phone rang. It was a call from the office where Thuan worked. She answered and put it on speakerphone because her hands were shaking. Upon hearing that his mother intended to turn in the files, Thuan's voice immediately screamed from the other end. "Are you crazy? Do you want to kill me? If you confess everything, what path do I have left to live?" Ms. Lazan closed her eyes, tears streaming down, but this time she was not panicked. She held the phone with both hands, her voice trembling but clear. "No, I am giving you a chance to be a decent person. If you keep living wrongly while being shielded, you will truly be dead." Quote, the other end went silent for a few seconds, then Thuan began cursing, crying, and blaming his mother for abandoning him. Min Kwan reached to take the phone to speak for her, but Ms. Lazan shook her head. She ended the call herself and placed the phone on the table. I saw her shoulders shaking repeatedly, yet she kept her back straight. Perhaps saying those words to Thuan was more painful than any scolding anyone else could ever give her. But it was also the first time she chose what was right instead of what was easy. On the morning of the third day of Tet, Min Kwan contacted a lawyer familiar with his company. Instead of rushing his mother to the authorities in a panic, he took her to see the lawyer first to organize all the documents. I didn't go along to play the role of the dutiful daughter-in-law, nor to prove my own generosity. I went to ensure that everything was handled correctly. No one should be forced to admit to more than they did, nor should anyone have the chance to keep shifting blame. The lawyer was a middle-aged woman with a calm, steady voice. After reviewing the preliminary files, she clearly stated that Mrs. Zahn bore responsibility for signing guarantees, borrowing on others' behalf, and concealing certain actions. However, voluntarily providing evidence and cooperating to clarify the cash flow and the list of victims would be crucial. The goal now was not to evade responsibility but to accurately determine who did what, where the money went, which parts were legal, and which showed signs of coercion or illegal lending. Mrs. Lazan sat and listened, her hands resting on her lap, nodding occasionally. The woman who was once so afraid of losing face that she threw her feverish daughter-in-law out of the house now sat before a lawyer, recounting every time she sold gold, pawned savings books, and borrowed from acquaintances to save Thuan. Her voice broke at times, but she continued to speak. Min Kwan sat beside his mother, not coddling her as before, but placing a glass of water before her whenever she choked up. That was his way of honoring his duty as a son, not covering up for her, but not leaving her alone to face the consequences. That afternoon, as we left the law office to prepare for our meeting with the authorities, Mrs. Lazan walked slower than usual. She no longer held her head high, no longer adjusted her clothes to look posh, and was no longer afraid of anyone seeing her vulnerability. She simply clutched the old metal box to her chest, as if holding the heavy truth she had evaded for so long. I followed behind, watching her silhouette, and understood that some awakenings come very late. But if one still dares to step into the light, then at least amidst the wreckage, a shred of conscience still survives. After Tet, everything gradually returned to the path it should have been on a long time ago. Thuan was held accountable for exactly what he had done. The victims took turns submitting documents, message logs, and receipts for the authorities to record. Some were furious, while others burst into tears while recounting how their lifetime savings were swept away by a few empty promises. Each time she heard another story, Ms. Lazan bowed her head lower. Perhaps only then did she understand that Thuan's mistakes did not just harm her own family, She had to sell her remaining personal assets to partially rectify the consequences. Not enough to compensate everyone, but at least it was a responsibility she could shoulder herself. Min Quan did not let his mother be threatened by the lenders, nor did he let her wander alone in her old age and broken spirit. He helped her work with the lawyer, categorizing which debts were legal, which showed signs of coercion, and which needed to be clearly reported. But he kept his promise to me. He did not sell our home, did not take out more loans, and did not sign any documents to take on Thuan's debts. One afternoon, after finishing the session with the lawyer, Ms. Lazan sat listlessly in the hallway. She had grown gaunt, and her gray hair was no longer dyed as carefully as before. I looked at her for a moment and asked, "Have you taken your blood pressure medication?" She looked up, surprised, as if she didn't think I would remember that. I said nothing more, just called a car to take her for a follow-up exam. On the way, the two of us sat next to each other in silence for a long time. Outside the window, the streets after Tet had become less noisy. Withered kumquat trees were left discarded by the roadside, and the red of the calligraphy scrolls faded under the sun. When the car stopped in front of the clinic, she suddenly said very softly, "On the 29th of Tet, I scolded you like that. Why did you still bring me for a checkup?" I looked at her hands resting on her thin, trembling knees. My heart no longer stung as it had in the beginning. But the wound was still there. I replied slowly, "I haven't forgotten, Mother. There are words that you hear once and remember for a lifetime, but I do not want to become the kind of person who caused me pain." Ms. Lazan turned her face toward the window. I saw her shoulders tremble slightly. She did not ask for my forgiveness immediately, nor did she say anything grand. A moment later, she nodded slightly, as if accepting that some mistakes cannot be erased by a few tears. From that day on, she no longer raised her voice at me. Sometimes she would start to say something out of old habit, then catch herself and stop. I know changing someone at that age is not easy, but at least she began to fear the cruelty of her own words. My husband and I then decided to move out for good. It was not because I wanted to sever the bond between mother and son, but because I understood that some distance is necessary to preserve family ties. Min Quan spoke to his mother one evening, very calmly. "I am still your son. If you are sick, I will still take care of you. If you need something reasonable, I will still provide it. But V is no longer someone you can take your anger out on, and our home is not a place where anyone can cause trouble and then expect us to pay for it." Mrs. Lazan listened and bowed her head for a long time. If this were before, she would have called him unfilial and cried about how hard she worked to raise him. But this time she only said, "I understand." Those 3 words were simple, but to us, they felt weightier than many promises. Because it was the first time she didn't insist on being right. Thuan was no longer the brother-in-law lounging on the sofa, criticizing me for being slow. After being held accountable, he had to face the consequences of his own actions. I felt no sense of triumph. In truth, when someone in a family faces legal trouble, no one wins. Those who err must pay the price, and those left behind must learn to live with scars that do not heal easily. Many nights, Min Quan would sit on the balcony for hours. I wouldn't ask what he was thinking, just leave a glass of warm water by his side. There are sorrows men carry that they never voice, yet those close to them can still feel. The following Tet, Mrs. Lazan sent over a small basket of oranges. They weren't expensive fruits, just a few yellow oranges arranged neatly, with a handwritten note on top in her slightly trembling script. "I don't expect you to forget, only hope that one day your pain will ease." I read those words over and over, then tucked the note away in a drawer. I would not call it total forgiveness, because the human heart is not a door that opens the moment you want it to. But I saw the orange as a sign that resentment could be laid down, bit by bit. After everything, I still think that Tet was the most painful one in my life. I had a high fever, was kicked out, and watched my husband's family shatter from secrets hidden too long. But that same Tet helped me keep the things that mattered most. My health, my self-respect, and a husband who finally knew where he needed to stand. Sometimes one must go through a painful ordeal to see who truly loves them, and who only needs them when in trouble. I don't want the audience to hear this story to hate a mother-in-law or pity a daughter-in-law. I just hope that anyone in any family using kinship as a pretext to make others suffer will stop for a moment. Because a home is not a place where the weaker one must stay silent forever. Home should be the place where, when someone falls ill, the first thing loved ones think of isn't bad luck, but how to ensure that person is at peace.